in the opening lecture about the future of cytology and pathology, and now he's going to talk to us about the near future, the present to the future. Thank you very much. We're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, and Kalispera again. Dave Wovasa, hello. And thank you for coming back to listen to me a second time. Today I'm going to talk about the utility of the Aptima HIV test in the new era. I just want to preface my remarks by saying that I think we need to be very, very careful with women and society and politics in relation to any HPV test. No test is 100% foolproof, that's the first thing. I think it would be very, very wrong of us to promulgate such a story in the media or to women or indeed to our political paymasters. These are the disclosures I gave last night. So first of all, I'd like to pay tribute to the work that is done here in Greece in relation to HPV. You've been extremely forward-looking. You've informed the narrative and the discussion in relation to HPV testing in your own country and internationally. I want to congratulate you for that. The Aptima test essentially is a step forward in the progression and procession of HPV tests that have been developed over the last 15 to 20 years. I'm working on HPV since 1986. I had hair then, and we've been working with RNA-based assays since the late 1990s. What attracts us to the Aptima test is that it senses the presence and activity of human papillomavirus. And last night I told you that essentially we have a test of risk now, which is HPV, and we are looking for the holy grail of test of disease. In actual fact, the Aptima HPV test is both a test of risk and a test of disease. So it does actually sense the presence and activity of HPV's transforming activity. And ultimately, we should then be in a position to be able to reduce unnecessary over-treatment of patients using this assay. So I think you're probably all familiar with this diagram. It has got several iterations. As you can see, we assume that we start with a normal cervical epithelium, and that becomes HPV infected. Majority of them will clear the infection. Between 1 and 4% will develop a clinically significant lesion. As you can see here, that the biodistribution of HPV DNA and RNA, particularly the E67 transcripts, differ in the epithelium in terms of their location and their distribution in terms of disease. So it's not too surprising then, given the fact when we take a smear, we take cells from the top of the epithelium, not from the bottom. And in the lower grade lesions, we will see DNA at the top and some RNA species. And then depending on the sensitivity of that assay, we will then make a decision whether this case is DNA or RNA positive. But in the higher grade lesions, which is essentially the raison d'etre for what we do, is to identify high-grade pre-cancer and that cancer that's more likely to progress and is actually showing transforming activity. You can see that the biodistribution of mRNA is preferentially better than that of DNA. Now last night I told you about our foray to the World Congress of Cytology back 21 years ago, and we produced the first monograph on P16, and at the time when we produced this, it became abundantly obvious to me that we were essentially using P16 as an epiphenomenon, or just a marker. And we were not necessarily addressing the basic biology of the disease. So I just want to share this with you. So, really excited about P16, it has been a wonderful thing, but of course, E67 oncogene activities in high-risk HPV are transformative, we know this. And we need to understand in terms of the cell cycle what happens. So regulation of the cell cycle is lost when we've got high expression of E7. E7 binds retinoblastoma, disrupts the E2F retinoblastoma complex, and it mimics the role of cyclin D1 and cyclin DK4 and 6 and drives the cell into a cell division crisis. E2F is active and free, and the cell can pass through the G1 transition. So if we just follow the cell, this is actually P16 accumulating within cells. But P16 only accumulates in cells because it's being driven by E7. So to me, it looks as though we should actually be looking at the a priori event, which is the expression of the transforming genes. So while P16 has been very, very successful and we've been part of that success story, we need to move back a chapter. And in the last 20 years, my own group has done a lot of work on looking at P14, P15, and P16 in terms of how these molecules are transcribed and translated. We've done a lot of work on the naturally occurring antisense transcript angle and how that becomes autonomous in terms of the context of a HPV infection being present in the cell. So, we now set the scene for the introduction of a test that should actually be detecting transforming genes of high-risk HPV, namely B6 and B7. I've worked with Hologic and Roche and BD for a long, long time. And I remember the bad old days of the conventional smear. It was a nightmare. And I remember the first time I got my hands on a thin prep slide, I actually brought it back from the United States and introduced it in Ireland. I was called a heretic, right? You shouldn't be doing this. At the same time, we brought home the PapMed scanner, right? And we started to do automated cytology. A year later, we introduced HPV testing. I very nearly lost my job over that because people believed that the science was not there to answer the biological questions at the time. We were convinced that in actual fact, we were there. So I want to congratulate Hologic because they have offered us a really good solution in terms of thin prep. And now they've given us a really good solution in terms of the test of risk, and I would respectfully suggest the test of disease through the Aptima HPV assay. So cervical cancer screening is an evolution. I'm old enough, and probably stupid enough, to have memories of those days of conventional pap smear, move into liquid-based cytology, move into HPV DNA testing, and now moving on to HPV mRNA testing. But of course, with every assay, you'll always have naysayers. And there are naysayers to the HPV-based assays and to the RNA-based assays. But all I can tell you is, based on what I know, on what I've seen, that Aptima is a well-validated assay, okay? And we have consequential and evidential information culminating with the Swedish Biobank study from Forsvik in 2018, which says that this assay is safe and has gotten good long-term follow-up data to 7 years. This is the assay evidence across all of the currently commercially available HPV tests and the approval levels that have been given. And you can see that the big three, Aptima, Hypercapture and Cobas, have ticked all of the boxes. Indeed, Aptima has actually got 5-year plus evidence. The Cobas Roche evidence is still in processing. And the other tests are trying to catch up. So this essentially is, a race. The race is determined by the amount of evidence that accumulates. So Cobas got a lot of evidence up front. Aptima has built that evidence over years. I want to address this issue, the internal process control in the Aptima test. In the Aptima test, there's an RNA transcript that is captured and amplified within the same reaction as the intended target for the assay. And the presence of a signal from the hybridized control probe ensures the integrity of the target capture, amplification, and detection steps for the assay for every sample. So I think this is a good step forward, and I think that issue of an absent internal control has now been addressed. But whatever technology you go with, and we've all of these technologies in the lab, right? So I have a whole load of Chinese walls up between all these instruments and all of these companies, right? But in the main, the Aptima test, as you know, is E6, E7 biased and detects transforming genes. Okay? If we look at the expression of transforming genes mapping to transforming proteins, the correlation is really, really good. The other tests use combinations of or use whole genomic hybridization processes, as in the hypercapture test. But there are issues that have arisen. And one of the issues has been the whole question of the integrity of the L1 region in terms of viral integration. Now, we haven't seen this issue that commonly. We have a lot of experience with viral integration. We were one of the first groups to actually publish on in situ hybridization for viral integration of HPV. But it is an issue out there and people need to be aware of it. And the data from the literature is suggesting that anywhere between 1 and 5%, or 10%, sorry, 5 to 10% of cervical cancers, but what we would deem adequate cellularity, could potentially be L1 negative. So you may get a false negative result because of the integration phenomenon. So you need to be aware of that. That's not an issue with the E67 test. This is a very, very interesting diagram which is culminated from a whole lot of studies. And what it says is that among the HPV DNA assays, there's only about 40 to 45% concordance if you compare the assays, you know, panel to panel, live to live in the same context. And, you know, that looks disappointing, but in some ways it's not unsurprising. No two assays will give you the same performance in terms of detectability, in terms of sensitivity, in terms of specificity, or in terms of reproducibility. So the family of DNA assays have a wide spread of results that are potentially generated. We've worked with Pretect Proofer from the early 1990s and with Aptima, and in the series that we have done, we get pretty good correlation between the two RNA tests. Of course, that's a function of statistical fallacy. The greater the number of tests that you compare, the greater will be the coefficient of variance, right? So if you're comparing A to B as distinct to A, B, C, and D, you're going to have a potential problem, and this is exactly what we're seeing here. But irrespective of the niceties and the subtleties and the intellectual arguments about using test A over test B, there is a tacit reality. What the hell are we doing in cervical cancer screening today? We want an optimal screening strategy that will identify those women with cervical cancer precursors that are likely to progress to invasive cancer, essentially to maximize the benefit of the screening procedure. And at the same time, we have a duty to avoid the detection and unnecessary treatment of transient HPV infections, of which there are a lot, and its associated benign lesions that are not destined to become cancers, thereby minimizing the potential harms of screening itself. Now that's a very simple rules base, but if you forget this rules base and you decide to operate as some kind of an alternative orbital, you're going to end up in trouble, right? This is the basis for what we do. So, our test needs a high sensitivity, it needs a high negative predictive value to detect cancer and cancer risk in the right form programs. You've seen this graphic before, okay? Aptima has the same excellent clinical sensitivity as compared to HPV DNA tests. We've shown it in our own lab, and all of these studies are showing exactly the same, whether it is hybrid capture 2 or COBAS. And I want to show you a real-world setting of looking at DNA, COBAS, versus Aptima RNA head-to-head in a population. And this comes from the Survival Network, and I want to acknowledge the presence of Professor Ronald Family, who's a co-PI on this investigation with me. We have 3 studies currently open in Dublin. The first one is called the HPV Primary Screening Study. And this is looking at molecular testing of potential triage strategies for HPV positive women. And the starting point of the branch is every single woman in the trial has a HPV DNA and an mRNA test. And then she will cascade to genotyping, a second round E67 mRNA test in terms of longitudinality, P16, P67, methylation markers, cytology, and then there's a set of 20 biomarkers that we have derived from European studies. And this primary screening study is to evaluate triage options. The second study that's opened is called SurvivalVax, which does exactly the same with women and girls that have been vaccinated. And the third study is actually taking this screening algorithm into the community for self-sampling to see how are these tests going to function. Right now, none of you in the room, including me, can say that the performance of any of the tests of disease will hold up in the context of vaccination. We just don't know. We also don't know whether in actual fact the tests of risk, the HPV tests, will hold up positive. But intellectually, I believe that a test that has the capacity to detect transforming infection, which is the thing that's going to give the woman cancer, has the best chance of picking up evolving, transforming disease in the context of vaccination. So the Aptima test fits the bill. So the HPV primary screening study is to inform the development of an algorithm for primary screening of women using HPV testing. And this is the trial, 13,500 women, primary screening trial, cytology-based primary screening, and then they have the split HPV DNA versus Aptima testing. Okay? And then they have a cascade of effects depending on whether they are positive or they are negative. And the first round results, so we will now be publishing the 3-year first round on these patients pretty soon. The overall DNA prevalence in the study is 15.9%. The mRNA prevalence is 13.2%. And we estimate, using our MISCAN modeling system, we estimate a reduction in colposcopy with the Aptima test of 22%. And if we look at the capacity of DNA versus mRNA to detect various grades, you can see that they're pretty similar in terms of their capacity. mRNA is slightly behind with ELSA, and we can explain that because of the biodistribution of transcripts in lower grade disease. And the genotype distribution is also pretty similar. But there is essentially a 3 base point difference between mRNA positivity and DNA positivity, which could have a huge impact in terms of colposcopy. Let's put this another way. If we try to assess risk of SIN2 following the triage options that we've developed within the survival primary screening trial, and this is data on the first follow-up 777 women, if we set thresholds in terms of less than 2% return to screening or greater than 20% referring to colposcopy, you can see that all of the players are performing as you'd expect. P16, P67 does very, very well. We have disadvantaged mRNA in this graph. So what we're presenting is the data for second round mRNA testing when the woman was DNA positive. And you can still see it is able to pull out those women very, very clearly who should go to colposcopy. Cytology still is a good test. Okay? Here is the data for P16, P67, genotyping, and then methylation in terms of paired methylation, total methylation for 3 markers. And you can see that some of them are just about getting to the colposcopic referral line, but some of them are not. So you have to put a random forest effect or tree map together to actually combine markers to give you essentially an orange or red index to take the woman into colposcopy. So is there longitudinal data on Aptima for primary survival screening? The answer is yes. There's the focal trial, the Swedish biobank study, the GAS trial, the CLEAR trial. They all can inform longitudinal safety and follow-up. I would say caveat emptor in terms of cross-sectional studies or studies taken out for other indications that are not powered properly. That type of a study will never and cannot inform longitudinal safety. So if we look at this 6-year negative predicted value, which confirms longitudinal efficacy in the routine screening population, here we're looking at data from 10,000 women, 30 to 60, one survival PIN-PREP sample, and the clinical endpoints are indicated here. The specificity of Aptima, 96.1, specificity of fiber capture, 94.9. If you model in a population of 1 million women, the reduction in colposcopy is the same as we found, 22-23%. You prevent 12,000 unnecessary colposcopy referrals. This is about using your resources better. This is about using smart science to drive smart medicine. So the Aptima HPV test was conclusively demonstrated the same excellent sensitivity for detection of SIN3, and the specificity is significantly improved over hybrid capture. If we look at data for 7 years, right? So here we're looking at the Swedish biobank study. You saw a little bit of this slide last night. So it's a big biobank, okay? 1,200 women subsequently diagnosed with SIN3. They've had 1,172 tests, Aptima versus HPV DNA, and the data is actually very, very interesting.